Over the past century, developed human societies have learned to tap groundwater for various uses. Thus, the question arises, are humans in competition with plants for the groundwater resource? Would excessive well pumping affect the health of vegetative ecosystems, particularly in arid regions where some plants are known to rely solely on groundwater? These are relevant questions because the health of arid vegetative ecosystems is at stake. The latter provide a host of natural services, including carbon fixation, erosion control, wildlife habitat, contaminant filtering, low albedo, and scenic beauty. These services may be impaired by the excessive pumping of groundwater. To understand where water comes from, how much of it is already committed by nature, and how much may be available for human use, we must take a close look at the hydrologic cycle. Water originates in the oceans, evaporates into the atmosphere, and moves inland, eventually to precipitate and convert into runoff, returning to the ocean to complete the cycle. While on land, runoff separates into surface water and subsurface water. In turn, subsurface water is of two types: one, unsaturated flow, and two, saturated flow. Unsaturated subsurface flow lies within the vadose zone. Saturated subsurface flow lies within the zone of saturation. The U.S. Geological Survey has estimated the quantity of groundwater as more than 100 times that of surface water. Thus, there is certainly a lot more groundwater than surface water. The advantage, however, appears to end there, because while surface water is generally fresh, the same does not follow for groundwater. The deeper the groundwater, the older it is, and consequently, the more saline it is likely to be. Also, while surface water flow is driven by gravity, groundwater pumping relies on imported energy. If the energy comes from burning fossil fuels, the carbon footprint increases. Thus, while surface water is entirely renewable, groundwater is not. The use of surface water is sustainable, while the use of groundwater may not be. Sustainability implies renewability. Lack of renewability is deemed to be unsustainable. All vegetative ecosystems satisfy their need for water by drawing either surface or subsurface water. Some may rely on surface water, some others on vadose zone water, and yet some others on groundwater. The mix generally depends on type of species, climate, soils, geology, and geomorphology. In humid regions, where the water table is close to the ground surface, plants may get their water from all sources. However, in arid regions, where surface water is scant, only plants that can successfully tap the groundwater may be able to survive the recurrent droughts. How does groundwater pumping affect arid vegetative ecosystems? The answer to this question requires a thorough grounding in concepts of geology, geomorphology, hydrology, and ecology. In the following sections, we endeavor to examine these fields in search for effective ways of resolving the competition between well plants and pumping wells. Geology is the source of everything natural. Local geology interacts with the prevailing climate to condition the geomorphology. Geologic uplift is responsible for mountain building. In turn, mountains are eroded by the action of rain and gravity. The products of erosion are transported by runoff, eventually to settle in and fill the downstream valleys. The accumulation of water below the ground surface in aquifers has been occurring throughout geologic time. Aquifers are of two types: one, fractured rock, and two, alluvial. Fractured rock aquifers are associated with mountains and uplands where rain is abundant and there is an active groundwater recharge. Alluvial aquifers are present in the soil-filled valleys and lowlands where groundwater discharge generally takes place. The rate of recharge and discharge of an aquifer is a measure of the speed at which it replenishes following recharge and depletes following discharge. The timing response of fractured rock aquifers may be measured in days and months, while that of alluvial aquifers may be measured in years and decades. This is because the flow of water within a rock aquifer is advective through the fractures, typically in a two-dimensional mode at relatively high speeds. On the other hand, the flow of water within an alluvial aquifer is diffusive through the porous media, occurring at much slower speeds than those that could be attained by pure advection. Fractured rock and alluvial aquifers differ in the predominant mode of exfiltration. Fractured rock aquifers feature springs wherever fractures in the water table intersect at or near the ground surface. Springs are related to the number, size, and connectivity of fractures. Therefore, they reflect the local geology and tectonic activity. On the other hand, the exfiltration of alluvial aquifers is driven by the local geomorphology, is characterized by stream bottoms, surface depressions, grabens, and so on. Fractured rock aquifers exfiltrate through springs. Alluvial aquifers exfiltrate through the baseflow of streams and rivers. The foregoing facts have a significant bearing upon the relation between groundwater and vegetation. Above a fractured rock aquifer, plants will colonize the immediate vicinity of springs, which for the most part are randomly distributed. This upland interaction between plants and groundwater takes place ostensibly in the absence of a clearly defined stream channel. Conversely, in an alluvial aquifer, plants are known to colonize the immediate vicinity of streams where the groundwater is shallowest. This riparian interaction takes place between plants and groundwater in the presence of a stream channel. This infrared image depicts a portion of Tierra del Sol in eastern San Diego County, California. Two branches of Tierra del Sol Creek are shown, featuring a riparian community of coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia, shown in red color, sparsely populated along the two ephemeral stream channels. Also shown on the bottom right is a tightly packed upland linear forest of red shank, Adenostoma sparcifolium, which is fed by water exfiltrating through a fracture in the underlying rock. In nature, geology, geomorphology, hydrology, and ecology are thoroughly intertwined into a complex web of relations whose sole purpose is to sustain the vegetative systems. Significantly, geomorphology stands out as the glue that effectively ties all the other components together. The role of geomorphology is nowhere more marked than in arid regions, where it determines whether a plant or ecosystem will exist or not. An example of such determinacy is an oasis, a depression where the groundwater comes close enough to the surface to be within reach of the vegetation. In certain places, depending on the local geology and geomorphology, exfiltration may be of such magnitude as to feed small lakes embedded in otherwise desertic landscapes. For instance, this figure shows the Huacachina Lagoon, an oasis near Ica, Peru. Groundwater exfiltrates into this natural depression located within Peru's coastal desert. This figure shows the vegetational gradient along a cross-section of the Mojave River Valley at Camp Katy, California. It is seen that different species occupy different levels in the profile. The dimensions of the terraces depend on the proximity to groundwater, which is conditioned by the local topography, that is, by the geomorphology. Vegetational gradients of the type shown in the Mojave River Valley are not restricted to arid landscapes. This figure shows the sequence of Cerrado Campo Gallery forest, which recurs in the subhumid, highly dissected savanna woodlands of Mato Grosso in central western Brazil. The Cerrado, or dense scrub forest, occupies the higher ground, out of reach of the groundwater. The Campo, that is the grassland, occupies the middle ground, subject to occasional flooding. The gallery forest occupies the lower ground, where there is a significant and active interaction with groundwater. In arid climates, surface water infiltrates into the groundwater as it flows over ephemeral streams. In humid climates, groundwater exfiltrates as the baseflow of perennial streams. By definition, baseflow comes from the groundwater. Therefore, the presence or absence of baseflow is a good indication of whether groundwater is exfiltrating to the surface or not. Streams with characteristics in between those of ephemeral and perennial are referred to as intermittent. These streams may have baseflow only during the wet or rainy season. The hydrologic peak to low flow ratio helps quantify the role of groundwater. Generally, the larger the stream, the lower the peak to low flow ratio. For example, for the Amazon River, the largest in the world, the peak to low flow ratio ranges between 2 and 3, the lowest in the world. In contrast, much smaller streams may have quite large peak to low flow ratios, depending on the local geology, geomorphology, and soils. For example, the Piraí River in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, may reach peak to low flow ratios exceeding 1,000 for a few days during the wet season, January to March. Large quantities of base flow are made possible by a shallow water table. In turn, this leads to a substantial interaction between vegetation and groundwater. In this case, plants are not limited by lack of water, being able to use all types of water, including surface water, vadose water, and groundwater proper. A total absence of baseflow implies a water table below the stream bottom, sometimes at a great depth. In this case, plants do not use surface water. Instead, they send their roots often to great depths to tap the underlying groundwater. These are the phreatophytes documented by Meinzer. In summary, local climate, geology, geomorphology, and hydrology interact to either foster or discourage the development of vegetation. In particular, in semi-arid and arid regions, more often than not, the presence of phreatophytes is an indication of the proximity of groundwater. In these cases, the depth of the water table may vary from a few feet to as much as 50 to 60 feet.